Okay. Well, last week was about the concept of appearance as it figures in science and metaphysics. And uh, I framed that as a sort of history of the concept of appearance. You remember the big sea change from thinking in terms of categories of resemblance to thinking in terms of categories of representation, and then what Sellars wants to do with that notion of representation. This week is all about his conception of reality, specifically as it figures in science and metaphysics, but I think his views open up a wider philosophical issue that turns on issues that matter for him more than the particular approach that he takes to them does. So if you have a scientific realist point of view, if you think science has any sort of privilege in telling us what's real, you're going to have to face the task of saying, well, what do you mean by science? Do you mean fundamental physics? Do you mean natural sciences rather than social sciences? Do you mean the special sciences as well? And you presumably don't mean that the privilege is attached to the science of today, November 2nd. So you have a challenge. What do you mean by science? And here, Sellars has a bold strategy. He has a version of Peirce's, ideal science at the end of inquiry approach. And that's something that various people have worked with since. Sellars has his own version of it. I want to take this as an occasion to think about that idea sort of more generally. Sellars' particular version of the relation that our current way of talking stands to reality is in terms of picturing. And we want to begin to understand that. He contrasts our conceptual scheme, our contemporary one, sometimes called the common sense conceptual scheme, with the Peirce-ish conceptual scheme, the one at the end of history. The relation between sort of our whole conceptual scheme and that Peirce-ish scheme, that's a little bit complicated too. Sort of what portion of our conceptual scheme is it? I think it's the portion that describes material objects, but I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. But if you look at the plan for this week that I put on the website, really the core of what I think we should talk about is point 3, the key moves that he makes in section 67 to 68. He says, only the last part of this is actually a quote, the other is paraphrasing. We can understand our conceptual scheme, CS, conceptual scheme, O for ours, picturing more adequately the objects there really are according to our conceptual scheme, than some predecessor conceptual scheme, CS, indexed by I. So the first move is, look, we can understand what it is for us to know more about what there really is than our predecessors did. So that's sufficient, he thinks, to understand the idea of some successor conceptual scheme index J, CSJ, some successor to our current conceptual scheme that stands to ours as ours stands to its predecessors. And then, second step, and this is the quote from 69, let us now go one step further and conceive of a language which enables its users to form ideally adequate pictures of objects, of the real objects. And let us call this language Persish. So, he's got a premise. Think about the sense in which our conceptual scheme is better than some predecessor ones. We know more about what there really is than Newton did, let's say. But now we have to transfer that or transform that understanding from the past, from a retrospective point of view, into a sort of prospective one, conjecture, think about some successor science, some successor conceptual scheme that stands to us as we stand to our predecessors. Well, there are delicacies involved in that move. And then the second move, well, if we can do that, then can't we make sense of an ideal, some scheme that doesn't have any more adequate successor to it? And again, strategies for thinking about that. Idealization or move to the ideal. So those are the two moves I want to focus on. The move from looking back at our predecessors and saying, I don't know, Aristotle thought that our brains were there as cooling mechanisms. He thought that if you cut off a human hand, it isn't a human hand anymore. We don't, I think, conceive things that way. He was talking about real stuff, brains and hands. We might not accept that they existed as he conceived them. Rutherford thought of atoms as miniature solar systems with spherical protons and electrons in them. He was talking about real stuff, electrons. We wouldn't say he was right in the way he conceived them, but he was talking about real stuff. So it seems to me that Sellars here is inviting us to think about what we mean when we talk about what there really is. We don't take it, I think, that our current conceptual scheme presents things as they really are. We do expect that, barring human catastrophe, that our successors will stand to us in something like the more privileged epistemic position that we stand into our predecessors. Nonetheless, we think we know something about what's real. We are talking about real stuff. How do we understand that? He's breaking down, suggesting there are these two moves. So that's where we're going, and I think a surprisingly varied spectrum of more recent philosophical discussion connects to these issues, and so I want to bring in some of those other ways of thinking. So let me start setting the frame. One of Sellars' innovations in science and metaphysics is he has two semantic levels that he's working at. on the one hand, ordinary semantics, ground-level semantics, talk about meaning, about reference, about truth. He has this, again, bold and idiosyncratic, non-relational view about the concepts of meaning, of truth, and of reference. He thinks the use of those semantic concepts should be understood in terms of functional classification, classifying expressions according to the job they do in the language, the role they play in the language. He thinks about those roles in normative terms, sort of the contribution that the occurrence of an expression makes to the correctness, to how it would be correct to use, sentences in which it occurs. But he sees all of that happening intralinguistically. The technical device of dot quotes is the principal tool that he's going to use to describe how we can understand and talk about these functional roles by appealing to the functional roles of expressions that we know how to use as the fixed ends and mapping other things onto it. He calls this a non-relational view, not that it isn't relating the use of rot in German to read in English, but it's not finding the essence of that relation, finding the essence of the relation between them in their relation to a third thing, redness, in the world. To talk about what red means is to talk about the role that it plays in the language. That's a kind of internal normative semantic discourse. I think it's important that what Sellars is really giving us for that ordinary semantic vocabulary is an account of its use, something that would be specified in a pragmatic meta-vocabulary. What you're doing when you talk about meaning, reference, and truth is functionally classifying expressions. What we would say about it in a semantic meta-vocabulary, well, maybe that's where relational things come in. In my writings on in the philosophy of language, I've tried to elaborate this Sellarsian picture, and mostly I'm not going to drag that material kicking and screaming in here. It's there's too much of it, it's too intricate. But I think his ideas can be elaborated into a theory of use, an inferentialist theory of meaning, founded on his inferentialism, and an account of the relation between use and meaning that is more articulated than he had. But Sellars says it's not that there isn't, besides this horizontal, intralinguistic, internal, non-relational view, it's not as though there aren't relations to things outside the language. There are, but they only matter at the transcendental level, at the level of transcendental semantics, which he wants to understand in terms of picturing. And picturing is, he tells us many times, not a semantic relation, though he also talks about it in terms of what we're really talking about and thinking about, and that about is a semantic expression in ordinary languages. This is the about of what I'm talking and thinking about, not the about of, the book weighs about 3 pounds. It's a distinctive notion, but he means the relation between appearances, conceptual appearances, not visual appearances now, the way we take things to be, and reality, the way they really are. And it's that transcendental semantics, reference to what's really there in the sense of what we're picturing, the relation between the way we take things to be, the way they appear in our conceptual schemes, and what things are in themselves, what they really are. That's a semantic connection, transcendental semantic connection, that Kant insisted we couldn't know anything about. Or anyway, what we could know about it was so thin that there was basically nothing to be said about it. What we could know of things in themselves is that they are, but essentially nothing else. We can't even count them, know how many of them there are, because they're not in space and time, or at any rate we can. So one of Sellars' innovations is he wants to bring that down to earth and say there is that transcendental dimension that relates conceptual appearances, the way we take things to be, by characterizing them, describing them in our conceptual scheme, and what we're really talking about, what there is in itself. But he wants to say that's something that we actually can know something about. And in the fullness of time, we'll know everything about it, because it's a matter-of-factual relationship between our utterances as spatiotemporal events in the world, as natural linguistic objects, as he says, sign designs. My image always is Wittgenstein's talk about the signpost considered just as a piece of wood, as apart from its significance as meaning something, as pointing somewhere, apart from the significance that it gets by the role that it plays in our practices of following signposts and putting signposts in. Picturing for Sellars is going to be an objective, matter-of-factual relation between the languagings, the utterances, the sign designs that we produce, and what there really is, the way things are in themselves. The way things are in themselves is how they would be specified by an ultimate ideal natural science, the science articulated in the Persish conceptual framework. And that framework will include an account of picturing relations between all conceptual schemes and what they are picturing. So we can't do that now. Kant was right about that. But on Sellars' version of transcendental idealism as scientific realism, that level of transcendental semantics, the level it describes at which we specify the relation between phenomenal appearances and noumenal things in themselves, that's going to be a matter-of-factual relation that science will be authoritative about, and in the ideal limit, tell us everything about. So Sellars' challenge is to make sense of that idea from the here and now. We can't jump to the Persish framework in order to actually see the picturing relation laid out for us. So what can we know now that lets us characterize that relation, talk about that relation, even though we don't know everything about it. So it is one of Sellars' innovations here to have these two levels of semantics. And to talk about the Persish framework, that's part of the enterprise of making sense of this transcendental semantic relationship. So, just not to be completely divorced from his text, in section 95 of chapter 5, he says, the claim that the common sense framework is transcendentally ideal, i.e. that there really are no such things as the objects of which it speaks, can now be reassessed and reformulated. We must distinguish carefully between saying that these objects do not really exist and saying that they do not really exist as conceived in this framework. For they do really exist, as conceived in what, omitting the qualifications which were introduced before, we've called the Persish framework, the framework which is the regulative ideal, which defines our concepts of ideal truth and reality. So the challenge is to make sense of the notion of reality. And that sounds like a central philosophical enterprise. And as I indicated a minute ago, he thinks it involves three steps: thinking about the way we've made progress from our predecessor frameworks, the sense in which we have more adequate conceptual schemes, a more adequate conceptual scheme than our predecessors did. Transforming that or using that understanding to make sense of the notion of our successors having more adequate conceptual schemes than we have right now, and then leveraging that understanding to project a regulative ideal of a Persish framework which Peirce himself thought of as in terms of a fixed point, where science would no longer have to make conceptual innovations. We'd find out more about matters of empirical fact, but not in a way that required us to change our concepts anymore. I'm going to urge that we lay alongside that a notion of convergence of a sequence of conceptual schemes, which wouldn't require that we ever actually reach the limit in order to get the ideal. But of course, there are challenges involved in making sense of that too. Now, one bit of ground clearing that I think it's useful to do before we embark on this is to ask, well, what portion of our conceptual scheme is he talking about here? If you remember the protasis from the Scientia Mensura, in the dimension of describing and explaining, he says science is the measure of all things, of what is that it is, and of what is not that it is not, that is not. So the claim is not that the normative functional characterizations in our conceptual scheme, the conception is not that natural science is going to be authoritative about those non-descriptive things. Remember the anti-descriptivist thread in Sellars that we saw in the first half of the seminar. There's a lot of stuff that he's not claiming natural science is authoritative about. I think we see, and this is something that will be a topic for next week, that he still wasn't careful enough in that leading qualification. He says in the dimension of description and explanation, I think what he means is in the dimension of describing and explaining material objects. We saw that in chapter 2 on appearance, the subtitle of that was material objects. It's appearances of material objects. I think that when he wrote the Scientia Mensura passage in EPM, he was sloppily running together the notion of description and descriptions of material objects. Whereas we use lots of descriptive expressions. The price of eggs, for instance, is a perfectly good descriptive phrase. It's not describing a material object. It's describing something about the role that eggs play in social practices of commodity exchange. It's not going to be natural science that tells us about prices. They're studied without maybe as much ontological attention as there ought to be in the social science of economics. So I actually think that there's 3 categories of concepts or subsystems in our conceptual scheme that we should distinguish when thinking about this view of Sellars. There's the descriptions of material objects. That's what natural science is to be authoritative about. He's saying, well, and which natural science? The Persish natural science. There's description more generally, and then there's the non-descriptive uses of the language. And we're really not focusing on either of those 2 categories here. Yeah.
If we take Sellars' nominalism seriously, how can there be a distinction between description of material objects and description in Sellars' own picture? There's nothing more in the word in the narrow sense. Material objects are exhaustive than word in the narrow sense.
Well, the world in the narrow sense is only going to consist of material objects. Everything else is going to belong to the world only in the sense where those things couldn't be in the world if there weren't discursive practitioners and discursive practices. But that doesn't mean that we can't distinguish within the things that aren't in the world in the narrow sense between descriptions of objects and non-descriptive uses of the language. And I think that distinction will be important. Many of the things he says about picturing go with description generally. So there's some room for fiddling there. I'm also meaning to put to one side, sort of for today, his nominalism. His materialism is important. It's material things we're worried about. But I'd like to divide through by, or at least bracket, his additional commitment that it's only material particulars that exist, that material properties, like being cubical, he doesn't think exist, though things grouped as cubes do. That's a group concept, and that he's going to allow. But I think we can discuss his views about reality without that. No, sorry, I cut you off.
So I wanted to make a clarification. So the idea is we can make a descriptions of the word in the wider sense.
Right.
That's the idea.
Right. There are many other descriptive uses, I want to say. He's only given us necessary conditions for descriptive uses, where he said, in distinguishing from labeling, that to count as a description, the expression has to be located in a space of implications. But it's going to be important when we think about description of material objects that we try and give some sufficient conditions. Well, there's lots of stuff that's situated in a web of implications. What are the specifically descriptive uses? Harry, did you have a?
I have a lot of questions and puzzlements about ideal science and the history of science, but let me just ask one question. So it seems the idea of, or correct me if I misunderstood, but it seems that language, descriptive language standing in a picturing relation to reality is sort of really important. So it's doing a lot of work, it seems to me here, right? So, and it seems that Sellars is sort of relying on the assumption that there will never be a time where it turns out that future science in fact shows that picturing relation is not the right relation to have to science, or does he allow for that? I think this is a sort of, does he just take for granted that he's right on the money on this point, and then maybe there's some small details that can be worked out in the future, but at least he got this much right.
I think he is committed to that.
Okay.
I think he would bristle at the characterization of him simply taking that for granted.
Okay.
He's something like transcendentally deducing that.
Mm-hmm.
He thinks it has to be that way. That's what he's trying to teach us. That, yeah. Okay. Before we talk about those three moves, that conceptual moves that I said was the key, there's one more complication that I think it's worth keeping in mind, or anyway framing of the discussion that he gives us. And this is that he wants to do two things that it can seem initially as though these are in tension with one another, and I think there's sort of tensions in the vicinity, but in the end I think he can make sense of the possibility of doing both these things, but it's worth keeping in mind that there's both of them. He wants to, okay, and I should say this is all taking place now in two registers. And by that I don't mean the two senses of semantics. One is at the level of conceptual schemes. We're talking about more and less adequate conceptual schemes. And the other is at the matter-of-factual level, where picturing relations are going to take place, where what's really going on gets specified. And he's working within a picture about the interaction of those. So he wants to define conceptual progress or comparison of conceptual adequacy. I'll say progress is when a successor conception is more adequate than a predecessor conception. So the notion of comparing the adequacy of a conceptual scheme and the notion of defining progress are really two ways of talking about the same thing. He wants to define conceptual progress, comparisons of the adequacy of conceptual schemes, by appealing to the notion of better picturing of what there really is. So we're going to step out to the level of picturing and the level of matter-of-factual relations among material things that there are in order to define the relation at the conceptual level. So that's one commitment, one methodological strategy. And the second is he wants to define the real, the level of the real, by appeal to a conceptual scheme that pictures ideally well. So there's clearly some danger of circularity here. Right? We're going to define the comparison of conceptual schemes in terms of picturing at the level of the real, and we're going to define the real by the ideal conceptual scheme, the one that pictures ideally well. So it's important to keep track of sort of which thing he's trying to do at the moment, as we read him. Again, just to touch base with the text here, this is a passage from section 57, which is just before the 67 to 69, where all the big moves are made. He says, linguistic picture making is not the performance of asserting matter-of-factual performances. The criterion of the correctness of the performance of asserting a basic matter-of-factual proposition is the correctness of the proposition qua picture, i.e., the fact that it coincides with the picture the world cum language would generate in accordance with the uniformities controlled by the semantical rules of the language. Conclusion. Thus, the correctness of the picture is not defined in terms of the correctness of the performance, but vice versa. Again, large framing picture. There's correctness in the internal functional semantic sense. Correctness of a performance. Is it justified by the lights of and practices of the community that's using this conceptual scheme? That's a matter of justification in terms of what we take to be reasons for what. But the transcendental sense of correctness is correctness as a picture. It's a matter of factual sense. That's really the notion of truth that matters here, the one that goes with reality. And at that transcendental level, what determines whether an assertion is correct or not in the transcendental sense is how good is it at picturing the real. I was going to say that comes in degrees, but the correctness of the picture isn't determined by what the norms are for what counts as justified in the conceptual scheme. That's all at the internal, in Kantian terms, empirical level. That's within the conceptual scheme. So he's sort of working here with a contrast between a realist order of explanation that starts with the notion of truth or reality, getting things right, and understands what's a good reason, what's a justification in terms of that. So in contemporary epistemology, reliabilists are epistemological realists in this sense. They say what it is for a belief to be justified really is for it to be the outcome, the output of a reliable belief forming process, where reliable means likely to produce a true claim. I think Alvin Goldman is probably the godfather of epistemological reliabilism, but there are a number of people working with this. You start with the notion of truth, reliability, and get a way of assessing practices of treating as justified or not. Let me say in passing, I had an ongoing dispute with Goldman about reliabilism and the relation between epistemology and semantics here, because he was inclined not just to say, when we're assessing whether something is knowledge or not, reasons and justification only come in as one species of reliable belief forming mechanism. But what matters is what are the reliable belief forming mechanisms, and having what count in your community as good reasons or justifications, that can be a reliable belief forming mechanism. But it's not essential to something being knowledge that it be something that you can give reasons for. So he says we can imagine sort of doing without that notion. I say, well, only if you can make sense of the believable contents, the contents of knowledge claims, without appeal to what's a reason for what. But that, I claim, as a semantic inferentialist, you can't do. In order to understand propositional contents, you need to think about the role they play in a space of implications, not just a space of that you understand in terms of reliability. And Goldman's response, after a number of exchanges, was, I'm an epistemologist, not a semanticist. I outsource the semantics, and I'm just making epistemological claims. I said, well, sometimes you can't be that specialized because you're making epistemological claims that have semantic presuppositions, in particular about the dispensability of the notion of reasons in general. So there's an article you can find on my website if you care about it, called Insights and Blind Spots of Reliabilism, in which I summarize this argument. For that was a possibly distracting digression. What I wanted for here is the distinction between a realist order of explanation that goes from some notion of truth or reality and understands justification and reasons in terms of that, as opposed to a broadly pragmatist order of explanation that starts with our practices of treating one thing as a reason for another, and understands truth and reality in terms of that. I mean, a really radical pragmatist, Rorty, says all there is our practices of treating one thing as justifying another, as a reason for another, and the idea of assessments that go outside that transcend that, is a mistake. Now, Sellars is, and admits that he is, in just these terms, adopting a pragmatist order of explanation from Peirce that starts from our grip on our assessments now of our having better reasons for a applying the concepts we do than our predecessors did, and seeks to leverage that into a notion of truth and reality specified at the end of inquiry. That's the Peircean phrase. Sellars doesn't use that. But anyway, with the ideal conceptual scheme, the strategy is to lever our capacity to assess better and worse applications of concepts according to our lights now as to what we take to be justifications and what we take to be reasons, to leverage that into a notion of reality, a transcendental notion of truth. So he's got both a realist strain of thought here and a pragmatist strain of thought. And the question is how he can, can he make them work together? Okay, so now I want to get to the core of things, to how he proposes to leverage our ability to assess, our confidence that we understand things better than our predecessors did, that we have a more adequate conceptual scheme than they do. A confidence which is not simple self-centeredness. We can actually give reasons when, if we revived Ernie Rutherford and talked to him about electrons, we could, well, I couldn't sitting right here now, but invoking my friends in the physics department and the chemistry department, explain why we think in terms of molecular orbitals and probability distributions, think quantum mechanically about the relation between the electrons and the protons in a hydrogen atom. It's not just that we say, well, we're later, we're better, this is the way we teach. No, we can give reasons, cite empirical evidence, point to general theories that articulate a better understanding along all sorts of dimensions that we can assess. But we've got to make these two moves. We've got to leverage that understanding into one that has us as the less adequate conceptual scheme, and then move from the comparative to the superlative, to the ideal at the end. Yeah, Harry.
Yeah, so this is just a request for clarification, because I can see how this thought works for a case like electrons, and maybe also for hands and body parts and brains, and then maybe geometrical entities as well, right? Those seem, there seems to be something that our predecessors have been thinking about, but it's not clear sort of before the discovery of the atom that there is anything to compare to. I mean, the sort of early Greek atomism is just not the same kind of thing. So I'm wondering, that just seems to be a point where it's no longer, it's sort of, we've come up with an entirely new framework, and so then the framework or the scheme that we're referring to is just different. It's just not, there seems to be some other account of being a better account, right? Because I think we all agree that it's a better account that we have of material things, right? But I'm just sort of curious as how Sellars handles those kinds of cases.
Okay. First of all, Sellars doesn't give us very much to work with here. I think we have to try and make these lines of thought work. But I think you're pointing to a very important distinction, and one I want to come back to and actually use in trying to help him help him out. But I think the picture would be, if we look at all these theoretical entities that we have elaborate theories about that are really important in our conception of things, that earlier conceptual schemes simply had no view about, that it is a matter of incompleteness. That we say it's not just that we're more correct about the things that you were already talking about, but we're also talking about more of the stuff there really is than you were talking about. I mean, there's stuff that they were talking about that they shouldn't have talked about. It wasn't real. There weren't any witches. There wasn't any phlogiston. So there's a bunch of their stuff where we say, no, just no such thing. But there's other stuff that they just knew nothing of. That's the picture of that. But I do think this is an important distinction, and I want to appeal to it later. Okay, before looking at this first move, there are two qualifications that he gives that we should have on the table. In 75, section 75, he says, notice that although the concepts of ideal truth and what really exists are defined in terms of Peircean conceptual structure, they do not require that there ever actually be a Peircish community. Peirce himself fell into difficulty because by not taking into account the dimension of picturing, he had no Archimedean point outside the series of actual and possible beliefs in terms of which to define the ideal or limit to which the members of the series approximate. Well, when we get to the Peircish move, I will cite Peirce. So he's saying, look, the point is, I'm going to give you everything you need to make sense of the notion of a Peircish conceptual scheme. But that's not to say there ever actually will be one, or that anything that I'm saying turns on there actually being this ideal. He describes it as a regulative ideal using the Kantian language. Second, nor need ideal matter-of-factual truth be conceived of as one complete picture existing in simultaneous splendor. The Peircish method of projection must enable picturings by observation and inference of any part, but this doesn't require a single picturing of all the parts. So it permits us, as it were, to focus on any one bit. I don't know, maybe the picture is of a searchlight in the dark, and there's nothing it can't illuminate, but that doesn't mean it has to be able to illuminate everything all at once. So this is a matter of, in a certain sense, lowering the bar for what he has to get to. Okay. In sections 54 and 55, he says, one conceptual framework can be more adequate than another. And this fact can be used to define a sense in which one proposition can be more true than another. This is the transcendental sense, not at the level of empirical semantics. Once again, I find myself in the position of attempting to revitalize themes from 19th century idealism. My primary aim in this chapter is to explain this comparative sense of truth with respect to matter-of-factual propositions. In the case of factual propositions, we're haunted by the ideal of the truth of the world, haunted by the ideal of the truth about the world. And that's what he wants to make sense. Okay. Now, why might it be a problem? What's the difficulty in recruiting our capacity to understand our conceptual scheme as more adequate than that of our predecessors into a definite and intelligible conception of what we're supposing when we suppose that our successors will have a conceptual scheme that is more adequate than ours in the same sense in which ours is better than our predecessors. Here's what I think is the big challenge of that. As I said, we have actual reasons that we can cite that matter to us now, that we can critically assess, justifying our claim that our scheme is better than that of our predecessors. Those are real reasons. Now, we're imagining our successors, they're going to be in the same, what I think we can suppose determinately is that they also can give reasons within their conceptual scheme, that is, what they take to be reasons, not necessarily what we do, just as our predecessors might not appreciate our reasons. They haven't seen this evidence. They don't know how to reason this way. They have reasons within their scheme for preferring their way of carving things up, the claims that they make to ours. But that isn't good enough. Imagine the scientific institutions being taken over by political or religious fanatics who introduced new forms of explanation that turned on the most important character for assessing a justification being its political efficacy in securing a certain goal, or its pleasingness to God according to this theology, or its consilience with sacred scripture. Conceptually, these changes in the kind of thing that counts as a reason needn't be thought of as more fundamental than, say, the change from Aristotelian efficacy of place. The rules for sublunary motion are completely different from the rules for superlunary motion. Things fall here, but the moon doesn't fall. And the new science comes along and says, we forbid appeal to where something is in explaining how it behaves. We forbid appeal to efficacy of place. The laws of nature as we conceive them have got to apply everywhere and every when equally. We now know Emmy Noether showed that that's equivalent to the conservation of energy. The laws of nature be the same at all times, specifically, is equivalent to the conservation. Well, and then, so Newtonian mechanics forbids appeal to efficacy of place. With general relativity theory, geometrodynamics reintroduces efficacy of place. It matters how strong a gravitational field you're in, and so whether you are at the bottom of a gravitational well or at a considerable distance from it, for what the shape of space is, and so how things move. Well, we go back and forth for hundreds of years. You weren't allowed to appeal to that. We come back and say, no, now you are. These are huge changes in fundamental explanatory principles. We can imagine the institutions of science being taken over and allowing forms of explanation that we would not accept as scientific forms of explanation, of empirical explanation. But then, of course, Aristotelians, scholastic physicists, wouldn't have allowed the uniformity assumption. Newtonians wouldn't have allowed the geometric dynamic. The mere fact that we wouldn't doesn't mean they aren't, in fact, better. That's not the point I want to make. The point I want to make is the mere fact that a successor framework, by its own lights, can give good and sufficient reasons for the greater adequacy of its conceptual scheme than ours. That's not good enough for us to have a conception of somebody who stands to us as we stand to our predecessors. Why not? Because we have real reasons. And if all we appeal to is that by their lights, our successors have better reasons than us, that's not the same as having real reasons. Just what they take to be better reasons isn't going to distinguish the case where there's genuine conceptual progress from the case where they just can tell a self-justifying story. So we want to say, well, okay, we don't want the degenerating kidnapping of the institution where we can understand, yeah, those theological maniacs could think that what they have are better reasons. What we're envisaging is that they really are better reasons. Well, what does that mean, though? We're trying to define progress. Well, that they have a better grip on what's really a reason for what than we do. But do we understand that? Do we understand what it means to say they have better reasons than we do? It's not just they think they do. Can't get there. We can't get a notion of progress that is what we want to mean by progress in this context. If all we can work with is what they take to be good reasons, that's not enough. Now, here I think we can bring in some more recent philosophy in trying to work out a pragmatist order of explanation that starts with justification and gets to truth, rather than a realist one that starts with truth and gets to justification. Crispin Wright suggested in his book Truth and Objectivity, this was a central idea of it. Well, the pragmatists start with a notion of what's assertable, what's appropriate, an appropriate claim to make by the contemporary lights, by what we take to be reasons, what's justifiable in our community. And we think of this as involving critical exchange, challenge, defense, and so on, but something is assertable by us. And some pragmatists, Dewey, Rorty, say, well, that's the best you're going to do. There isn't anything that can trump that, which is not to say that we couldn't improve, but what do we mean by improve? That's the question we have. Crispin Wright says, well, the notion you're after is what I'll call superassertability, where a statement is superassertable, roughly, if it's assertable, and if it can be warranted by some state of information which would continue to warrant it, would continue to be a reason for it, under all possible additions of further information to that information state. So essentially, super-assertability is assertability that's robust under arbitrary increments to your collateral information. So no matter what else you could find out later on, it isn't going to infirm this claim. And this is assertability for claims, but the goodness of a reason, so it's an inference. The inference wouldn't be defeated by any further information that you had. And I've argued that this notion of superassertability won't work. It's either wrong, it's giving you the wrong, not the notion that you're after, or it's circular. And the way to see that is to ask, well, what do you mean by information? It's supposed to be robust under arbitrary additions of further information. That could just mean further claims that you take to be true. But that wouldn't define the right concept, because if the other things, among the other things, would you shut that door for me? Thank you. Among the other things I could take to be true could be all kinds of false things. And nothing, no claim is robust when conjoined with arbitrary other false claims. No, then, so that wouldn't give us the right notion. If we combine it with arbitrary other things that we endorse, that we take to be true, well, those could be false things. Nothing's going to be robust under all the possible additions of things we might take to be true. What's intended is that it's real information, but that means true claims, that it's robust under arbitrary conjunction with further truths. Well, that's circular if you're trying to define a truth notion. And in fact, I think it doesn't even get it right in the circular case, because stuff you don't know anything about, that you're ignorant about, is as bad as false claims. So just adding true claims isn't necessarily going to immunize you against error. There's another version of a pragmatist strategy like this that J.T. White wrote about under the heading of success semantics a few years ago, where the thought was that you could tell in practical reasoning whether you'd gotten what you wanted, have a desire to get satisfied or not, and that we could define a set of beliefs as true just in case every action that you performed based solely on those beliefs was successful. And the trouble here is stuff that you don't know can get in the way of these true beliefs leading to success just as much as false claims. I really want cookies. I believe there's cookies in the cabinet. So he's saying, well, if that claim is true, then you should succeed in getting the cookies. But if I'm ignorant of the fact that the cabinet was nailed shut overnight, or though there are cookies in them, they've all been infested with worms. There's all sorts of stuff that I might not know and need not have positively false views about that would get in the way. I put the sort of 5-page paper that I wrote about White's thing in the supplementary readings in case you want to see how this goes. But roughly, I hope you can see that the issue is the same one. We have real reasons for making our claims rather than the claims of our predecessors. What we can make sense of from our successors is them thinking they're in that position, them taking themselves to have those good reasons. But that isn't enough for them to be, for the move to count as progressive. For us now to say that they genuinely, that anybody who took themselves to have better reasons for their claims than ours would count as a more adequate conceptual scheme. That's not what we're after. That doesn't get the right notion of progress, the right notion of more adequacy. What we need is some way of saying, yeah, they really have reasons, as we take ourselves to. But it's not enough that they take themselves to. And of course, the rules of the game say, well, it's not enough that we take them to either, because they're supposed to be better than us. So, what do we say? So this first move that Sellars makes is much more fraught and difficult than he takes it to be, to make sense of, from the here and now, of the difference between genuinely progressive developments and ones that aren't. Now, be clear, we're not requiring that we can know now what would be a progressive development and what would not be. It's an ontological question or a conceptual question. What do we mean by a genuinely more adequate conceptual scheme, by genuine conceptual progress? What can we mean now by that? Now, it would be really radical if the conclusion one had to come to is, well, I'm sorry, you can't mean that. You think you can mean that some of them would be progressive and others not. Okay, I can't tell which ones now, but when I suppose that there's a progressive development, surely I'm supposing something different than when I suppose that there's a development that is not rationally, conceptually progressive. It would be really radical to say, no, there simply are not conceptual resources for you to mean that. But there's a challenge as to how you can. Here's a proposal as to how to fund that. As I said, not attributing this to Sellars, he didn't worry about this enough, I think. He didn't hear, and this isn't something he ever sort of substantially revisited. And it appeals just to the distinction that Hari made earlier. You know, if we could go back and if we could bring Aristotle here and had the people who could actually talk to him, I'm not going to worry about that, surface language here, and said, look, we're in a world of wonders. We understand things you didn't understand. Not so much about politics, but about the material world, we do. not about the phronimos, but about material things we understand better. We can measure the mass of the electron to 12 decimal places. He would say in Greek, the what of the what? That's not impressive. And we can imagine our successors telling us, well, we can measure this other thing. Don't know about that. I don't know whether you're measuring something real or whether you just have this fantasy, it's this kind of goblin that you've got. We can tell what species a goblin is just by thinking about it. So I don't know, is it that thing or not? But you say, we can make really large holes in the ground. You can tell as well as we can how big a hole is in the ground. Now look at this. We push the button, boom, and there's a gigantic hole in the ground. And he would say, yeah, that is a big hole in the ground. We couldn't do that. There's some things that are prospectively accessible. Aristotle, we can fly from one place to another. Wow, look at this. You can actually fly even better than birds from one place to another. I can understand that. You can do this wonderful thing. Roughly, those things that are prospectively accessible, the distinction Harry put on the table and that I'm appealing to here is there's some ways in which we're better that are not prospectively accessible. The earlier ones couldn't say, oh yeah, you've made a lot of progress in measuring the mass of the electron. But there's other things they could. And a minimal condition on progress is that you make progress like that. Progress now of natural science in the material world, that you be able to show that you can do things that we can tell you can do using our conceptual scheme. Even though we can't do it, but we can tell that you can do it. And we couldn't do it. Well, that's a reason to think that you're making theoretical progress. And this very dynamic has been hugely important in human history. When the Arab warriors took over the Western world, and the Greeks had all these wild theories. Didn't make any sense. Arabs. But the Greek doctors could cure diseases and save people from battlefield wounds that the Arab warriors knew were fatal. And the Greek doctors could save people from those. That was something the Arabs could tell. And they asked the Greeks and said, well, how do you do this? And the Greeks said, well, you have to understand the relationship between the microcosm and the macrocosm. You have to understand all of this stuff, all this philosophy that we've got. And there's, well, the Greek physicians are really good. They obviously understand something we don't understand. So let's translate all these books. Let's gather them up in libraries. Apparently, we need to know about the microcosm and the macrocosm and so on in order to be able to keep people from bleeding to death from these battlefield wounds. We owe the preservation of most of Greek literature to exactly this phenomenon, that they could persuade the Arabs by doing things that the Arabs couldn't do on the basis of, well, from our point of view, a lot of the theory was less closely connected to the practical abilities they had, medicine being the big one than they thought it was, but they were onto things. They were onto things. So it seems to me there is some prospect anyway of picking out technological progress in a narrow sense that means progress that's accessible by less developed folks who can already tell how far and how fast you can move, whether you die when you're stabbed here, whether you can get that big rock out of the way where it is inconvenient. They can tell those things, and if you can do that, keep the machines running and build machines that can do more of the stuff that is accessible prospectively, that's at least a necessary condition of progressive theoretical and conceptual development. That's a thing to mean by technology in a narrow sense, is what's prospectively accessible. Lots of it isn't. Lots of the conceptual things, mass of the electron, so on, are not. So anyway, obviously there's a job of work to be done to use those resources to make sense of a notion of conceptual progress. That is, to bring off that first step that Sellars was invoking. Say, well, you understand the sense in which our conceptual scheme is more adequate than earlier ones. So on that basis, you understand, don't you, what it is for a later one to be more adequate than ours. I suggested, well, that's actually much more difficult than he thinks, but there are some resources we might appeal to do it. And furthermore, those resources might be special to natural science dealing with material objects. That is, if we start to think about what economic or political, scientific, or sociological technology in that narrow sense is, well, I don't say that there's none, but it's harder to find such a thing that's going to be accessible prospectively in that way. Yeah.
I was thinking whether there's a possibility to, I don't know if this is a generalization of the proposal you had or a different proposal, but what if it's a more general proposal in terms of, well, here's the way I want to put it. And we might wonder if we can make sense of the notion of us giving ourselves reasons within our current conceptual scheme to adopt a new conceptual scheme. If we can make sense of that notion, and in general make sense of the notion of one conceptual scheme seeing another conceptual scheme, either earlier or later, by their own lights as better, then we might be able to think about what the relation of, so suppose you've got two conceptual schemes. The first sees the better, sees the second as better by its own lights, and the second also sees itself as better by its own lights than the first. We can get this relation. Now, if we we can ask what would happen if we were to have a chain of these relations converging or meeting forward indefinitely and converging. And I wonder if this could be a way to generally make sense.
Well, I'd like to hear what you're saying as a more general specification of sort of the form of the technology first account I was offering, because I was picking out a particular kind of reason that one scheme could have that could lead it to recognize the later one as more adequate. But I think it does matter that it's this particular kind of reason, sort of prospectively assessing your capacity to do tasks that we already have standards for assessing now. If we put it in the very general terms that you did, that we now have reasons to make the move to this, well, that could be how we get to the degenerate political and religious fanatics accounts too. Sort of each step seemed like a reasonable move. There were reasons to do it. That's sort of using the weakest parts of our reasoning to get to bad places, to dead ends and degenerating things. So I would think it's a necessary condition, but if one treated just our being able to appreciate good reasons for making the change and them having further reasons retrospectively for it, I think that's too weak to rule out all the sorts of degenerate cases. And remember, the task is to say what we mean.
Do you want to make a slight modification to my proposal? So we have this relation of, the second is seeing itself as better by its own lights than the first also seeing the second as better by the first's lights. We've got that relation. Now we can look at chains in which, so you've got 3, 4 conceptual schemes in a chain, and the first sees the second and the third and the fourth.
And needs to approve all of them.
Yeah, it approves all of them.
Yeah, that's definitely adding real substance to it. I think that's a good piece of the puzzle. As I say, I don't pretend to have in my hip pocket an adequate account of sort of what to mean by conceptual progress here, and so I think thinking of that sort of at each point, all the later moves have to have some. Is that too restrictive?
It seems like the Pearson idea involves this sort of hope that this thing would happen. So I wonder what the empirical, or as a matter of fact, it's probably going to happen. But
Peirce goes back and forth. In his very first statement of this, I think I'll read some of the quotes later on. He says, it's a hope that there's a drift that will end up, that sort of no matter what we do, there's a drift that will end us up in this place. But other times he says, no, what I'm talking about is the position we are fated to arrive at as long as we keep doing what we're doing. I say there's different modalities. The one, well, it's possible, it's likely. No, it's necessary that we get there. Okay, so yes.
I have a question. Can you clarify something for me? When you were giving your preamble, I sort of had this idea that we were going to this picture of like transcendental conceptual schemes. So I was thinking specifically of the sort of empirical critique to Kant and the kind of response to that. So Kant talked about space and time being a priori forms of intuition, and how in our world, like the correct geometry is Euclidean geometry. And then from there, when non-Euclidean geometries were introduced, the critique was that Kant was wrong because this is actually not how our space is designed. But then the response to that critique is, well, it's just that we don't exist on a curved space in our everyday life. And so I thought that where we were going when thinking of adequate or good conceptual schemes was saying that it's transcendentally ideal, so that it doesn't matter if you're in a Euclidean space, non-Euclidean space, or any future space that we haven't been on, because we're not on that space. We exist in this kind of sorry, and I think I'm just, and I guess what would be wrong with that kind of picture of conceptual progress, maybe I'm thinking about this incorrectly, or the question that I'm asking is a different one.
I mean, at least the question of whether, Kant could be empirically refuted by other kinds of geometries.
Yeah.
That I think Sellars doesn't mean to be addressing, because he's admittedly altering the Kantian picture so much in trying to think about, in treating things in themselves as absolutely knowable, empirically knowable, even though we don't know them. So I think from his point of view, he'd see the enlargement of forms of geometry. The Euclidean is still a special case of these others, that they're nested in this way. Would see that as conceptual progress, and that people had found out more about what there really was, and yes, could see us poor creatures, including the philosopher back in Königsberg, as only having empirical experience of such small bits of space that these differences didn't make a difference to them. So the idea that Kant had, that he had to be able to tell from where he was what the a priori form of space was, that's something that Sellars is giving up anyway. So I think he isn't addressing that question. Okay, well, let me remind us that the question is, what do we mean by real? We're trying to make sense of the notion of reality. And here we don't even need to mean real in the narrow sense, in Sellars' narrow sense, that's completely independent of its relation to us. When we talk about what there really is, what do we mean? Okay, we don't know what's real in that sense, but what is that sense that we're after the reality? And I think Sellars is right to see that question is inseparable from the question of, what do you mean by conceptual progress? Those are two ways of thinking about the same thing. And that's the issue that I've been saying has this structural difficulty of separating sort of what you take to be reasons, justifications, and truths, and what really are. That it seems that it's very difficult to make sense of the notion of progress and therefore of reality without presupposing that distinction, but that distinction is using the notion of reality. And yet, suggested maybe we can, working in the pragmatist direction, that is from sort of here and now, what do we take to be reasons, from the notion of justification to a notion of truth and reality. We're not without resources in doing that, but there's a job of work to be done there. Okay, well, when we come back after the break, let's look at the idealization move, the second move that Sellars says we need to get a transcendental notion of reality. So it's 2:35. Let's come back at 2:50. Okay, so I'm going to talk about this second move that is part of the decomposition Sellars is suggesting for how to get our minds around the idea of reality, how to mean something definite by talking about reality, about things as they are, as they really are, as they are in themselves, by invoking the Persish conceptual framework. And this move says, well, look, in the first move, I've taken your capacity to make retrospective, comparative judgments of the adequacy of conceptual schemes and leveraged that into a way to understand comparative judgments about the adequacy of conceptual schemes generally, sort of no matter where on the temporal scale they are. Now I want to leverage your capacity to make those comparative judgments into the capacity to make sense of an ideal. You understand better than, one conceptual scheme being better than another. I want you to move from that to an understanding of what the best would be. That's a movement from a comparative to a superlative. And he says you should be able to understand the superlative, the one that's best, and that nothing is better than it, or it's better than everything, if you can understand better than. And the first thing I want to say about this is an argument by the philosopher Peter Unger in his wonderfully titled book of epistemology called Ignorance. And he points out that the relation between comparatives and superlatives is more complicated than you might initially think. That we can take a comparative and say, well, the paper here, though it's a little crumpled, is flatter than my sweater is, and the table is flatter than the paper is. And now I can introduce flat as perfectly flat, the flattest that something can be, and can understand the comparative in terms of that superlative and say by flatter, I mean really more nearly perfectly flat. And in that sense, the superlative is implicit in the comparative because I can paraphrase the comparative in terms of the superlative. But that's not true of all comparatives. Bumpy. Well, the paper is bumpier than the table. My sweater is bumpier than the paper. Does that mean that my sweater is more nearly perfectly bumpy than the paper or the table? Well, what is perfectly bumpy? How many bumps per inch does it have, and how high are they? You can't paraphrase bumpier than as more nearly perfectly bumpy because that superlative doesn't make any sense. And you can see that things are more complicated than you might have thought when you see that flat and bumpy are the same concept, or just two sides of one. They're opposites. If A is bumpier than B, then B is flatter than A. You can say the same thing in flatter talk or in bumpier talk, and yet one of them takes a superlative and the other doesn't. So the question of whether the relation between comparatives and superlatives that lets you define comparatives in terms of a superlative or would let you go the other way around, whether that holds, well, it depends on what the concept is. For some of them you can do that, and for some of them you can't. Unger's point was the ones that you can paraphrase in terms of the superlative almost never actually applies to anything. And what he was concerned with was claims that were more certain than other claims. And that the idea of perfectly certain that people had thought was implicit in that, he wanted to argue didn't actually make any sense. That was how the epistemology was supposed to go. Probably you already are hearing echoes of Anselm's ontological argument. God is the being, well, as the most perfect being, that is the being than which no greater can be conceived, about which, with slightly different examples, his contemporaries asked, well, so what is the football player than which no greater could be conceived? How fast could that football player run? How high could they jump? There isn't a superlative that goes with that. Is there with every thing where you can say this is a more perfect X than that? Can you always go to the superlative? This is not an objection. It's just saying you can't. It doesn't follow from the fact that somebody can do the comparison that there's a superlative available, or that it's even intelligible that that comparative corresponds to a superlative. Now, that having been said, we're talking about perfect concepts, realizing that we need to think about the whole set of them. And Kant seems to have had a picture that he shares with his empiricist predecessors of a perfect set of concepts. They would be ones that you could use to synthesize any manifold of intuitions, where the picture is, I may have thought that that thing running across the lawn that I caught a glimpse of, I synthesized my intuitions under the concept dog, used that rule, and made some inferences from it, and eventually got intuitions that I couldn't synthesize under that rule. It just, when it came out from the other side of the bushes, didn't look like a dog anymore. It was doing things dogs don't do. So I take that rule, put it back on the shelf, and pull off the shelf another rule, another concept, fox, and use that to synthesize that manifold. And if I have an adequate set of concepts, there'll always be one that I can pull off the shelf to successfully synthesize all the things that I've got, all the intuitions that I'm presented. The sense in which sensuous intuition is unconceptualizable is not that there aren't adequate concepts to do it. It's that if I start making judgments when I look at the back of my hand, using this adequate set of concepts that can synthesize anything into judgments that won't lead me to contradictions when I synthesize these all into a systematic unity of apperception. But I make judgments about the shape of this finger and judgments about the color of this part of it, and I can just keep doing that forever. I'm never going to run out of new judgments that I can make, new concepts that I can apply to it. That's the inexhaustibility of sense by concepts on a sort of cartoon Kantian picture. But there could be a fully adequate set of empirical concepts that, though I might pick the wrong one, I picked dog rather than fox, I have concepts such that everything can be synthesized under it and in a way that will all hang together into a unity of apperception. Hegel claims that's wrong. That's the wrong way to think about the inexhaustibility, the conceptual inexhaustibility of sense. He thinks that a paradigm, to use an example that Sellars uses in his early writings, I have a concept of an acid as something that tastes sour and turns litmus paper red. And I go about synthesizing things under that concept, and that's fine, until I run into the substance that tastes sour and turns litmus paper blue. And now that's giving me incompatible commitments by my own lights. I make the inference it's an acid, so it's going to turn the litmus paper red, but I look and it's blue. And that tells me I can't have that concept. And now I think, oh, well, maybe it's only clear liquids that taste sour that are acids in the sense that they turn litmus paper red. And I try that. And Hegel thinks it's a metaphysical fact that every set of determinate concepts will turn out to be like that toy acid concept, that there is some sensuous presentation that would require you to change your concept. That the very idea of a fully adequate set of empirical concepts, in the sense that no correct, by their own lights, applications of them to things would ever lead you to incompatible by your own lights commitments that tell you that that the inferences curled up in those concepts are wrong. He says that can't have, that's an unintelligible conception of the relation of the conceptual to the sensuous. Now, I mention this because one way of getting to sort of the end of inquiry, that's a Peircean phrase, is to get to a fixed point, to a steady state. We move from one conceptual scheme to another under pressure by making judgments in empirical circumstances. And maybe we get to one where we just never are obliged to change the concepts. We'll make new judgments. Every time I look at something new, I'm going to be making a new application of the concepts, but not of the sort that ever requires me to change the concepts. Hegelian and empiricist picture, that can happen. That's an intelligible thing. Hegelian claim, no, that's actually not intelligible, that fixed point picture. But there's another alternative. Sellars actually mentions this, and it's near and dear to Peirce's heart, and that is a convergent series of conceptual changes. Each change is progressive, but the changes get smaller and smaller. You're making fewer and fewer mistakes. You're having to fill in fewer and fewer incomplete areas each time, and you may never get to the ideal limit that it's converging to, but still we can talk about that ideal. We can talk about the limit in the way we can talk about the limit of a converging series. J. Rosenberg, who was Sellars' star student, longtime faculty member at UNC Chapel Hill, has a chapter on this. I think he's really the only one who ever thought hard and wrote about this chapter in Sellars, and says, well, there's an objection to a convergence view, and that is that the notion of the limit is the notion of the thing you're getting closer and closer to with each subsequent new conceptual scheme. Suppose we're numbering them. We started off with the inadequate one being I, went through CSO, our J. I should mention in passing, he refers to the contrast that he cares about as the CSO conceptual scheme, ours, and the CSP, the Persish conceptual scheme. I hope you saw what he did there. That's Peirce's initials, Charles Sanders Peirce, that he uses for the CSP. That was not just an accident. That was a joke on his part. But suppose we number them. We've gotten to N somewhere there, and we want to know, does this sequence converge? Well, if convergence is a matter of getting closer and closer to the limit, then you've already got to have the conception of the limit. And Rosenberg points out, well, that's true with Weierstrass convergence, the one you probably learned. For every epsilon, there is a delta. That is, we have the limit. Any distance, however small, epsilon from it, there's some delta you can add to n such that the n plus delta element of the series will be closer than epsilon to the limit. That's the Weierstrass definition of convergence. But the older Cauchy notion of convergence, it defines the limit, defines limits and convergence without stepping outside the sequence of elements, in this case, of progressive conceptual schemes. It says for any epsilon thought of as the distance between n plus 1 and n, there's some delta, some n plus delta, such that the distance between n plus delta and n plus delta plus 1 is less than epsilon. So you're saying that the distance between sequential members of the sequence is getting arbitrarily small. And though there's some cases where these diverge, they're really arcane cases. Basically, you can define convergent sequence in the Cauchy way, not just in the Weierstrass way. And so that was Rosenberg's proposal for how to make this move to an ideal. He says, well, once you've got the comparative, it's got to be, you've got to be able to compare comparisons now and say that these two this conceptual scheme the difference between these two pairs of conceptual schemes, where the second element of each is more adequate than the first, but the difference in adequacy is greater in the one case than in the other, then you can do Cauchy convergence. So that's what you need to add, is comparisons of comparisons. Quine in Word and Object says the trouble with Peirce's idea of conceptual schemes converging to an ideal is that convergence is defined for numbers, not for theories. Rosenberg suggests, well, we could look once the real conceptual differences have settled down, we could just look at the numbers that were coefficients in the fundamental physics to do this. I actually think it's scandalous that Quine wrote in his greatest work the sentence convergence is defined for numbers, not for theories. Yeah, convergence is defined for a lot of things mathematically. And in, again, in the supplementary readings, just because I couldn't bear not to, I included some excerpts from my first book, co-authored with Nick Rescher, in which I make great use of the fact that convergence is defined for nets or paths on complete lattices as well. And we're representing theories in that book by complete lattices. I may say some more about how this works later on, not later on today. The point I wanted to make now is there's real conceptual work you can do trying to respond to the challenge of specifying what you mean by ideal, given that you can make various kinds of comparisons. And it depends on how you're representing conceptual schemes. But if you represent conceptual schemes by implication spaces, that's the kind of that's what we do inferential semantics on in the book Ulf Lobel and I have just finished. If you do implication spaces, it's easy to define complete lattices on them and convergence of paths from one implication space to another. And that's a representation of a conceptual scheme that we can do a lot of work with. For instance, we can interpret any fine style truth-maker semantics into an implication space semantics. So the second move, like the first move, there's challenges to go to a definite notion of an ideal, but those are challenges that can be addressed. We have conceptual resources to do that. And Sellars' claim is to get to the notion of reality, you need these two steps. You need that notion of ideality. Here I want to read some of the, just a couple of the Peirce passages. So one early one, to assert that there are external things is nothing different from asserting that there's a general drift in the history of human thought which will lead it to one general agreement, one Catholic consent. Okay, that I think is a fixed point vision. Here he says again, there may be some questions concerning which the pendulum of opinion would never cease to oscillate, however favorable circumstances may be. But if so, these questions are ipso facto not real questions. That is to say, are questions to which there is no true answer to be given. Because by true answer he means the one that we would settle on if we kept doing it. And finally, different minds may set out with the most antagonistic views, but the progress of investigation carries them by a force outside of themselves to one and the same conclusion. This activity of thought by which we are carried, not where we wish, but to a foreordained goal, is like the operation of destiny. No modification of the point of view taken, no selection of other facts for study, no natural bent of mind even, can enable a man to escape the predestinate opinion. This great hope, and And now we have the editors give us a note. In the first draft, he says, this great law is embodied in the conception of truth and reality. The opinion which is fated to be ultimately agreed to by all who investigate is what we mean by truth, and the object represented in this opinion is the real. This is the general line that Sellars is invoking here, and that leads us to want to talk about convergence. And the last point that I want to make about the convergence idea here is there's serious modalities involved here. You could say, and some people have, to talk about the real is to talk about something that in principle we could find out about. In principle we could know that it is possible that by sequentially improving our conceptual scheme, we could get to a complete picture of it. The notion Peirce is working with involves very strong modal necessity claims. He claimed in that middle passage that a proper scientific methodology would be guaranteed to converge on a unique result independently of the starting point. That is, whatever wacky beliefs we started with, as long as we were using a proper scientific method and so advancing only in a progressive manner to a more adequate conceptual scheme, that there is some place that we'd be guaranteed to get to, that it's necessary we get to. Only thing that could stop that is if you stopped using the methodology or didn't get to do enough iterations. But we can imagine something weaker than that it's guaranteed to get to this unique result, provided you aren't too far off when you start. If you start with sort of really wrong-headed ideas, it may be that the method can't get you to that unique result. Well, I mean, that suggests we can think about methodologies. Methodology takes a conceptual scheme or a sequence of them and gives you the next one, the next better one. We can imagine that fixing the methodology, depending on what your starting point is, you get to different places. You will converge, and different starting points converge at the same place for this class, and this other class of starting points converges to this other point, but they're not the same point. Now maybe that's a bad thing to mean by real. If there's multiple places you could get to, fixed points you could get to, but it depends on where you start. Well, but then why are you so convinced that we're in the situation where some methodology would get us, no matter, independent of starting point, would get us to that point? Look, it's a non-trivial claim that there's a methodology in that sense that no matter where you start is guaranteed to converge. Maybe some of the starting points are so confused that you never get to converge on a limit if you start there, though from other ones you do. But there's a bit of moral luck involved in whether you're on a path that can converge. Maybe only some of them converge. So the claim that what we mean by reality is a conceptual scheme that, with a proper methodology, one that guaranteed progress at each step. We were worried about progress before. would be guaranteed to converge on the same place. That's a very strong requirement. Peirce is saying that's what we mean by talking about what's real. And that if the best we could do was one of these other situations, that wouldn't count as a conception of reality. And maybe he's right about that. But if he is the right contrast class with appearance the real, the way things really are? So, I mean, I do actually have views, but I'm not, that's not the point. Here, Sellars, by giving us what is, in a way, a fine-grained account of how you can entitle yourself to mean something by the term real, by first entitling yourself to talk about the sense in which our conceptual scheme is more adequate than our predecessors, and then using that to define, to make intelligible the notion of a conceptual scheme that stands to ours as ours stand to our predecessors, in the sense of being more adequate, counting as conceptual progress, and then projecting from that a notion of an ideal of the conceptual scheme to which progressive moves would converge, with the question about this modality. But I think Sellars is with Peirce on this. He's thinking, no, there's got to be one far-off divine event towards which the whole creation moves for you to mean something by real. And though I've suggested that Sellars' account isn't fine-grained enough, because he doesn't address the questions that each of those steps raises, but they set out, I think, a fine-grained philosophical terrain, a set of criteria of adequacy for meaning something by the real, and one that certainly anybody who's inclined to a scientific realism, who thinks, yeah, and at least for some subset of appearances of material things, let's say, to have a slogan for it, Sellars is right, or anyway, there's a lot of go to the idea that natural science is our best route to that. Well, there's all this philosophical work to be done to say determinately what you mean by talking about how things really are. And I say this, I think, is independent of the nominalism, oh, it's just things that we've got. And even if you think the materiality isn't maybe the most important one to look at or whatever, these are the questions that are going to come up in articulating a definite sense to the term real, which, say, metaphysicians ought to be concerned with. I've invoked Crispin Wright and Peter Unger and all sorts of contemporary near contemporary philosophers to try and make the distinction, show where work needs to be done, but can, I think, in many cases, be done. So I haven't much talked about Sellars' other views. I haven't, for instance, today talked about how specifically the notion of picturing is supposed to do this. I'll say something about that at the beginning next time. That's where we'll come in. But I think this philosophical terrain that is opened up here is important in its own right. And Sellars does give us an entry to it. So that's what I've been trying to set in a frame. And if you don't like the Persian one, whatever, still people assume they know what they mean, or at least assume there is something they mean, even if they acknowledge they don't know exactly what it is they mean when they talk about the real. But it turns out it's a complicated constellation of commitments that are involved in meaning anything by that term. And it's less obvious than it might be that it's a term one ought to endorse. At any rate, if you want to use it, I've indicated something about the kind of work you have to do to entitle yourself to use it. So I think it's a shame that Sellars never revisited this issue after he wrote this book. He lived for another 20 years, and he just had so many things he was thinking about. He didn't get back to this, but we can, and not because one cares what, not because of Sellars' exegesis, but because he's opened up an important problem area here. Okay, well, that's the story. I hope that if you go back and reread the passages that I excerpted from the chapter with this background in mind, you'll understand sort of what he's going on about in the chapter better.
I have a question about, it seems like we can draw a distinction between having an ideal conceptual scheme, defining an ideal conceptual scheme and defining reality. And I was wondering why Sellars talks about, and we're interpreting Sellars as defining reality as opposed to defining the ideal conceptual scheme. I guess to just say one more sentence, it seems like we might think, well, we already have a sense of reality. You can say that, a statement is real just in case it's the case.
So, I started off with this innovation of Sellars of having two semantic layers. And one thing I can hear you saying is, look, this idea of ultimate reality, the transcendental notion of reality that he gets at with the notion of an ideal conceptual scheme, maybe that just doesn't make any sense. I mean, within our conceptual scheme here and now, the difference between the way something appears and the way it's real is something we can settle often and say, oh, that was merely an appearance, or because it's not visual appearances that we're talking about, it's sort of conceptual appearances. Oh, that's something you misunderstood, and really, this is the way things work. I think it's fair enough to have a less metaphysical and ontological notion of reality, not aim for a transcendental notion that would contrast with any and all appearances, which is the one he's after here. I do think his, and he does sort of invoke the real side when we look at how picturing works with this, those sort of two potentially circular, he's going to assess more adequate conceptual schemes by better picturing and define the real as in terms of the ideal conceptual scheme. That's where we'll start next time. What's pictured is not happening at the conceptual level. Neither the picturing nor the pictured is part of any conceptual, is conceived as part of any conceptual scheme. But it has to be specifiable in some conceptual scheme for him to mean something sort of definite by it. The idea of the conceptual schemes confronting something unconceptualizable, that's the bit of Kant. Well, the things in themselves are precisely things as not having concepts applied to them, because the concepts have to be subject to the categories, and that's all not part of the world in the narrow sense, but only the phenomenal world. And the question is that really intelligible? That's a way to go, that transcendental idealism, but that is the part almost all of Kant's admirers have found hardest to swallow, let me say. And Sellars is giving us something like the alternative. There's particularities to his view, but if you're not going to say that the way things really are is in principle unknowable, but nonetheless we can invoke the idea of it and mean something by that, if you're not going to swallow that, then you're going to have to wrestle with